Well, thanks everybody, and good to see all the familiar faces, all the regulars and some of the new guys. So I guess I better be on my game over here. Let me just briefly say that the thought of talking about how flaps got started and breaking up flaps into different groups like the golden age of flaps and the silver age and so on and so forth. And it struck me that there's sort of a perfect golden age for flap collecting that starts when flaps start. And we'll talk about that a little bit. The starting time is a little bit fuzzy about what we know or what we think we know or what the folklore is. But the demarcation line between the golden age of flaps and the silver age of flap, in my estimation, is very much right at 1954. So that made kind of a good grouping of things to put together over here, and we'll take it away. The question is, why 1954? Why is that a good date? And that's because it was in 1954 that something really major happened related to the Scout uniform, Scout insignia, Order of the Arrow insignia on the uniform, and how it was put into place all in 1954. And that really changed things into what has really evolved today. I know that not everybody on the call is a OA collector. Our friends from Canada usually don't get too involved in OA. And so some of this will be new. But for those that have been in the OA, that have worn a flap on their shirt at one time or another, there's a real story here that is worth taking a look at these days, I think. So I also thought, the best place for this little presentation to start was at the end. Start at the end, and the end ends up being the NOAC in Laramie, Wyoming in 1954, when the golden age of flaps came to an end. We'll take a look at that. In 1954, the OA put out a new version of the OA Handbook. It had a new cover. We'll see some of the previous covers, but this cover was introduced at the NOAC in 1954. It was the 1954 printing of the 1950 edition of the OA Handbook. And as we'll also see, that the 1950 edition of the OA Handbook was actually just another version of the original one from 1948. But there were different changes along the way, and some of them apply to what we collect and what we're interested in this whole story of flaps. And this is the thing that changed right here. And I'm going to read it because I think it's worth reading it, and we'll see how we got here. Cloth emblems are frequently made available by local lodges. For some of the younger guys, they never called these things patches. Back in those days, they called them cloth emblems. Very hoity-toity. We call them patches, usually embroidered, showing the name and totem of the lodge. It is strongly recommended by the National Committee, and that would be the National OA Committee, that these emblems be made to fit the shape of the right shirt pocket flap. The right shirt pocket flap has been approved by the National Committee on Badges and Insignia for official Order of the Arrow insignia, where other emblems are only temporary insignia when used on the uniform. It should be realized this is a great advantage and a compliment to the Order of the Arrow. And it was. And that's what made all this stuff official. One of the things that could have led to the Committee on Badges and Insignia pronouncing the pocket flap, of all places, is the place on the Scout uniform for OA patches, and strongly recommend these patches be flap shape. And I think that's where the interest in the story lies, because what started it all began over 100 years ago. This is a picture of it's a well-known picture in historical circles for the OA. It shows Erna Goodman and Carol Edson. The arrow is pointing to Carol Edson at the first National OA Grand Lodge meeting in 1921, where they were reenacting the very first vigil of the Order of the Arrow. And Carol Edson is wearing obviously a turtle emblem on his ceremonial robe, along with the headdress. And by our standards, even today, over 100 years ago, that's a patch. And the OA started using patches on their robes and Indian regalia a long time ago. At the 6th annual Grand Lodge meeting hosted by Mincy Lodge, Lodge number 5, cloth totems were approved for local lodges. Pins, brotherhood pins, little brotherhood pins, and vigil pins had been approved earlier than that, but they went ahead and approved emblems, and these are emblems right from that period of time. Most of these emblems, these are the 3 lodges represented, starting off with a version of the Unami turtle, felt on felt turtle, from that period, the mid to late 1920s version of the turtle. And then the Lodge 4 ran across Chenilles. The ownership of this thing has passed through some of the people on this call and is quite a story by itself. And then the Lodge 5 Mincy Chenilles were some of the kinds of cloth emblems that the few lodges that were around at that time that had chartered were starting to use. One of the things that these emblems have in common is, for the most part, they're pretty good size, except for this little 5 chenille right here on the bottom, which is sort of pocket size. But the other ones are too large to be sewn to a scout uniform anywhere. And they were never really intended to be sewn onto a scout uniform, as far as I can tell. Part of the issue with that was that the Order of the Arrow, when it started out, was not an official part of the BSA. They were approved as an experiment in 1922, but it wasn't until 1934 that they were really taken on as a program of the BSA. And so there's a little bit of a question as to how could badges or insignia that weren't part of the BSA program, how could they have any place on a scout uniform? And they didn't. They were used in other places. But after 1934, when the OA then was taken on as an official program of the BSA, the badges were worn all over the place. This is an interesting assortment of badges from various periods of time, from the 1920s to the 30s and into the 40s. Lodges used to wear them on sweaters. These are Ayashi felts that were worn out of Manitowoc, Wisconsin, Lodge 73. They were worn on the bottom of the merit badge sash. Over here, we've got a Tribe of Mazashaw OA patch worn on the pocket where you would wear a camp patch. The Lodge 37 Octu might have been used as an armband or a shoulder patch. This civil defense insignia was unique to Lodge 209 Texoma as service projects that they were doing. The normal civil defense symbols are the same, but the colors are different. The 370J was worn on a jacket or a sweater, I guess. This one is worn. I don't know what it came off of. This down here is a sateen from California, Lodge 252, worn on a red and white neckerchief. This is the famous Chappaquiddick upside down flap, which was not worn on the flap at all, but was worn above the flap, from what I heard. along the way above the strip that said BSA. And then here, for those that have this part of their screen, the Lodge 26X. There are many versions of the 26X going all the way back to maybe the late 20s, certainly the early 30s. And they wore their patch above the right pocket flap. And then in 1954, when pocket flaps were approved and recommended as the place to wear the patch, then they moved them on down to the flat patch. But none of these patches were ever designed to be on a pocket flap. And so it becomes kind of curious then, with this type of a beginning, how did the pocket flap turn out being the spot where obviously flat patches are worn today? I did a little bit of research on this for this presentation. Hadn't really thought about it much, but maybe you can think about it too. Have you ever seen any other flat patches other than Order of the Arrow flat patches or Scout patches that were made for the flap for a Cub event, or some of those other kind of flat patches that there are, but they're scouting? The military doesn't seem to wear them. Schools don't wear them. Other clubs, they don't wear them. It's kind of it's a thing that, wow, could that really be unique to the Boy Scouts? And if so, how did it happen? So I went back and looked at some military uniforms. These are Roman Empire soldiers and different things. And they didn't wear flat patches on their uniforms because they didn't have pockets. To be sure, there's no pockets on these uniforms. So that sent me kind of down another rabbit hole of, well, just exactly, when were pockets put on uniforms? Yeah, I had never actually thought about it before. And it turns out that pockets started to be put into clothing sometime in the early 1800s or the late 1700s. Pockets started out as just separate bags that people would keep things in their coat or whatever, and then slowly it started to turn into, well, maybe pockets can be sewn into a jacket or onto a shirt. I took a look at a bunch of Civil War uniforms, Union and Confederate, and I didn't see any pockets on those uniforms either. It turns out that both armies had pockets in certain places, a small interior pocket inside the jacket, and maybe some pants pockets, but the shirts did not contain pockets for Civil War soldiers. I didn't know that. See, and thanks to Johnny and Larry with this great digital Cracker Barrel, we get quality information like that for you to know that, hey, there were no pockets on Civil War uniforms. So then I fast forwarded to Baden-Powell to see what kind of stuff he was wearing on his uniform or uniforms. So the picture in the center is a very young BP while he was in the military. So this is around the Boer War periods. I'm not an expert on BP stuff by any stretch of the imagination, but he's got on this military shirt. It's definitely got pocket flaps on it, and there's no insignia. This next picture on the right to that is taken of BP, obviously later on in his career after the 1929 World Jamboree. Again, he's got pockets on his uniform, and there's nothing sewn onto the pockets. So I started thinking, oh, I never really thought about this. How did this all happen that the pocket flap became a thing, and so much of a thing that there's been tens of thousands of pocket flaps made, obviously, for all the lodges. We continue to make them like crazy. And how did that happen? Here's a well-known poster and seal for the 37 Jamboree, typical 37 Jamboree uniform. Many of us have somewhere in our stuff, we have the insignia guide for where to put the jamboree patch and so forth. And there were instructions for every patch. The jamboree patch was supposed to go above the right pocket. The troop numerals, community strips, patrol medallions, the Eagle badge and rank badges on the left pocket. The left pocket flap seemed to be reserved for medals, pinning on medals, Eagle medals, whatever medals, hike medals, religious medals, not a patch in that sense. And the right pocket flap was no man's land. There's nothing on the right pocket flap. And so that started to change slowly. In 1948, the Grand Lodge of the OA was dissolved and taken over by the National Council of the BSA. And the program was fully integrated into the BSA. And as a result of that change in 1948, the Order of the Arrow prepared its first national handbook. Some of you have this handbook in your library. Others have certainly seen it. And the book itself was edited by J. Rucker Newberry, who at the time that he was working on that, he was a national committee man. At the time he was working on this, he was in Lodge 236, Unilee, in South Carolina. And J. Rucker Newberry was also a patch collector, as it turns out, for the time and the era. I mean, keeping in mind that most people on the call have patch collections that are 10, 20, 50, 100 times more patches in your collection than a patch collection from someone who was considered a patch collector in the late 1940s. But he was that guy, and one of those guys, and he collected OA patches. And so part of what he put into the OA handbook was 2 pages of pictures of cloth emblems. And these were the 2 pages. For those that collect this kind of stuff, they know what a lot of these are. But in the day, a lot of the OA patch, the design of the OA patches fell into 2 basic categories. You either had totems that may have had WWW on them, but they were the totem of the lodge. So that was very popular around this point in time. Or if we look over here, we start to see some patches that look more like camp patches that have lodge names, they have symbols, other stuff going on, and they're not just straight totems. For those of you that are really into this stuff, and I know for our New England friends like Roy and Rob, J. Rucker Newberry got this patch right here upside down. He wasn't sure what to do with it, and I guess, or he didn't know, and it was upside down, and it's not really even an OA patch, I guess. So it's a camp patch, but the New England fellows of our group could talk more about that. But the rest of these are Order of the Arrow patches. And as you can see, there's one patch in the center here, this one at the bottom of the center, and it's in the shape of a flat, kind of odd shape of a flat. This is what the 1948 handbook said about OA patches. They call them cloth totems, not patches. And they say they are frequently made available by local lodges. The totem is usually in the nature of an embroidered emblem, although we all know that many of them are silk screened or felt on felt, showing the name and totem of the lodge, and it may be worn on the right shirt pocket of the uniform. The right shirt pocket, not the right shirt pocket flap. And what we know is that the right shirt pocket is also the place where camp patches and other temporary insignia are worn and were worn on the uniform. And I thought this was interesting too. The patch needed to be approved by the council. So this wasn't really just a situation where the OA guys can make up a patch. and do their own thing. They really needed to get the council, whoever did that at the council, whether it was the scout exec or camping department, whoever did that, that was, or the pro advisor of the OA, had to give the approval on this. So what is this patch? This patch on the bottom right here. Doesn't have any writing on it. It's got an arrow. It's got a buck, and most of you know what this is, but some of you haven't seen it before. And what it is, it's a Lodge 33, Ajapoo Lodge, Bucks County Council patch. That's their insignia. It's from Doylestown, Pennsylvania. The lodge was formed in 1927. Their totem was a buck. And today, all these years later, we consider this to be the first pocket flap shaped badge. This is the patch that started everything at a time where everything else was what we call an odd shape and anything but a pocket flap. Now I've got this map up here of the Council of Lodge 33, Bucks County, Pennsylvania. For those of you from this part of the country, you're pretty familiar with this, but from California and other places, you may not know. Just how is this situated? This is Bucks County, outlined in red over here. It was Lodge 33. The two main towns are Doylestown and Quakertown. And it's really close to Philadelphia, where Lodge 1 is. It was bordered on its southwestern side by Lodge 43, Valley Forge Council. And then across on the other side, Lodge 2 in Trenton, New Jersey. So this is a council, Bucks County Council, and it's also known for being Amish country as well. And Bucks County Council is like one of those places that's really situated sort of in the heart of where the Order of the Arrow really got started and really became what it was. There's been a lot of debate about when this patch was issued, the Ajapoo F1. And in my research, I'm fairly comfortable with saying that this patch could not have been issued prior to 1944. And we know it had to have been issued by 1948 because it's in the 1948 Handbook. So that sets the back end. I think the reason why we can set the front end of this at no earlier than 1944 is because the Ajapoo flap is on Explorer green. And the Explorer green uniform shirt was not introduced until 1944. So if this patch somehow was made earlier than 1944, it didn't really match the color of the scout shirt, didn't have a place to be on. So it's not clear to me why they would have made an Explorer colored flap for a place where they didn't even have it. When it comes to who designed this flap, we don't know. It's one of the most famous flaps in Boy Scout collecting. And we have no clue who designed it. Lodge 33 is still an active lodge. They've done some research, I guess, but they haven't done the real digging kind of research that on their own home turf that may produce some results to give us some answers on just whose brainy idea was it to make this particular flap out of nowhere? And why did they want to put their insignia on the flap? We already talked about the fact that the military didn't use the flap for insignia. Schools didn't use flap on pockets for insignia. That other scouting stuff didn't use the flap for insignia. So what were they thinking? Why did they do it on a flap? And we don't know. The other question I have is, why did they want to cover the whole flap? would have been easy to make some kind of badge that's diamond shaped or whatever. I mean, some small thing, and sew it onto a flap if they were just really dead set on using the flap as a location for their patch. And it would have made more sense because everybody knows that a pocket flap has a button going through it. And if you're going to cover the whole pocket flap, you got to do something to have access to the button. So on first blush, it just wouldn't make sense to cover the whole flap. But that's what they did. And we don't know why they did it that way. And then finally, we've already discussed this. Did any other scout groups, military clubs, or whatever, did they ever make a shape of a flap and use the flap for? And the answer is not that I'm aware of. Now, you may have some awareness about this, but it's very, very possible that the Order of the Arrow and the Boy Scouts of America in 1948 is the first time that anyone figured out they could put a patch on a pocket flap. Crazy, huh? What is the significance of the 1948 Handbook to Patch Collectors? This is a pretty important document in our hobby. It's the first OA handbook, and it's the very first Scout picture book, which is pretty amazing if you think about it. Prior to that time, there had never been a book or a pamphlet or anything showing different Boy Scout patches. This was the first time it had ever been done. And it was given out to all Arrowmen. There had never been an OA handbook before. So when they made up the 1948 book, that was the one that everyone who was already in the OA got at that point. It had perfect coverage. It went out to everybody. There were 40,000 or so active Arrowmen in 1948 alone around the country. And between 1949 and 1952, there was an additional 60,000 new inductees. After World War II, the OA was growing like crazy, just like the scouting movement. And there were all kinds of new lodges being formed and councils that didn't have OA. And just the coverage was tremendous. The other thing is, this was an official publication of the Boy Scouts of America. And so to have a picture of a flap-shaped insignia in the 1948 handbook legitimized the idea that that was an okay thing to do, to make a patch that was flap-shaped. And it had the backing of the Order of the Arrow and the Boy Scouts of America because it was in the handbook. One of the things that I've asked myself knowing this is, if J. Rucker Newberry had not put in that Lodge 33 flap-shaped badge, would we even have flaps today? Would anybody else have ever thought of this idea? Would it ever happened on its own? And of course, we could speculate about it. We'll never really know. But that's really how it started. So in 1950, they did the first reprint of the 48 book. They went ahead and they changed the cover, but everything else was pretty much the same. Now, there's another story going side by side with this story. And the other story is the story of the Wabaningo emblem handbook, Lodge emblem handbook. And that was started by a teenage lodge chief named Dwight Bishop, who was lodge chief. He was actually a lodge chief of 2 different lodges in his youth. At this time, he was lodge chief of Lodge 248 in Evanston, Illinois, where he was going to school. But he was previously lodge chief of Lodge 214 in Bay City, Michigan, which is one of the toughest numbers to get a patch from. And he was inspired. I had the opportunity, along with Bill Topkis to get to know Dwight Bishop. We went to his house. We stayed with him and his wife for a couple of days and just spent the entire time talking the whole time. And he had a lot of stories to tell and had a pretty good memory of everything that he had done. And one of the things that he told us was, because we asked him, why'd you start collecting patches, Dwight? I mean, where'd this whole idea come from? And he said, well, I saw them all in the OA Handbook. And I was going to different conclaves up in Illinois and Michigan, Region 7 stuff, and the patches were floating around, and I liked them and I was interested in them. So I started collecting them. And then he started photographing them. And he developed the idea right around 1950 or a little bit before maybe, to put out a complete catalog of pictures of Order of the Arrow patches and include the lodge names and the numbers and where they were from. In the OA Handbook, the 2 pages of pictures by J. Rucker Newberry didn't even indicate what lodge numbers they were or what the names of the lodges were. As I started working on this project, and so much emphasis has been put on the first flap, and I started thinking, what was the second flap? You know, I mean, if there's been 50,000, 100,000 flaps made, you don't get to 100,000 from the first one without going through the second one. And I had never really thought about it that way before. And so it seemed, sort of by deductive reasoning, that the second flap patch was probably from Lodge 43, Delmont. Lodge 43 from Valley Forge was the council right next door to Lodge 33. And these guys probably saw each other at different events and different things that they went to back in the day. And Lodge 43 decided to come out with its flap patch. They went with a design that it was very similar to the 33 Adjepoo, but they added 3 W's. They had the border the same color as the patch, but they made their patch solid embroidered. So I know that some people in the OA hobby collect S1s, first solids, and this is it. This is the first solid embroidered patch, flap right here for that collection. And these can be had, you know, they're not cheap, but they're not as expensive as some of the other crazy ones. Now, inside the 1950 book was the picture of one of the pages was the Adjepoo flap. And at the 1950 National Jamboree, there were a few flaps floating around. And so it wasn't lost on people that there was a piece of insignia floating around out there that was not approved for the location that the insignia was put. Is this a big deal? Well, I don't know. The uniform today has so many things on it. I don't know if it's the same now as it was then. But the Scout uniform was supposed to be only the stuff that was supposed to be on there and approved. That's all you were supposed to have on your shirt and stuff. And so you have some of these airmen now that are wearing a flap shaped patch. There weren't too many of them. Maybe 10 different lodges had flap patches by 1950, just 10. But they were around. And word sort of got back to the National Committee on Badges and Insignia that there was a patch, an emblem, a piece of insignia being sewn onto shirts that was not approved by anyone. And that just couldn't be that way. And so the National Committee on Badges and Insignia made a suggestion, probably more like an order than a suggestion, but I wasn't there. I don't know how it came down. And they told the OA, on your next printing of your handbook, we'd like you to take this patch this flap-shaped patch out. That's giving people ideas for a type of insignia that's really not allowed. And so the OA complied, and they replaced the flat patch with just a round pocket patch. This happened to be from Lodge 212 from Bloomington, Indiana. Otherwise, the picture was exactly the same. And so you have to start wondering what was going through their mind when they did that. What were they hoping to accomplish? Well, it would seem logical. I mean, they didn't leave notes to what they were hoping to accomplish, but it would seem logical that one of the things that they wanted to do was stop giving airmen ideas for patches that shouldn't be on their uniforms. And maybe they figured if they just, there weren't that many that had done it at that point. Maybe they figured, well, you know, maybe if we can stop it now, that'll be the end of the problem and we can all move on. But it turned out it was too late. By this point in time, by the time the 1951 OA Handbook got out there, there were already over 150,000 copies of the 48 and 50 handbooks out in people's hands. And the new handbook was only going to maybe new inductees from some lodges, and the word wasn't spreading as fast, and nobody noticed the difference in the picture. It wasn't like they had sent out a note and said, no more flaps, you guys. They didn't do that. At the same time, Dwight Bishop got his book out in 1952, and it was distributed at the 1952 NOAC. Bishop's book, he sold a lot of those, and I can't remember what the number was. I have it written down somewhere in our interview, but he sold over 10,000 copies of this book. Now, some of you may be wondering, hey, where are those collections from the people that got these books, you know, and were collecting out of this book? But mostly what he showed predominantly was odd shaped patches. Out of the 179 images that he showed, there were only 7 pocket flaps out of 179 lodge patches that he showed. So it was kind of a unique stroke in timing that Bishop preceded the era of flaps in general. And he created this demarcation line for when his book came out. Hardly any flaps at all, although he had some. He had 7 flaps pictured, and he described 4 others. And it's now thought that maybe there were 10, maybe there were 12, I don't know how many other lodges that were using flaps that Bishop was unaware of. I mean, like any collector at the time, Bishop had a huge collection of these things, but there were a lot of things he had never seen and didn't have. And he didn't have any lists to collect off of. So he was just out in the open getting things that he hadn't seen. And he made no effort to say that everything that he pictured was all that there was. So this is an interesting little collection for people that are bored and with their collecting interests, and they decide they need a new little collection that only has a few members to it. These are the flaps that were pictured and described in the WAB book. And some of them are interesting that we don't think of. For example, on the Lodge 33s, Bishop described that it came in 2 colors for Explorer and for Scout, and it came on wool for Scouters. And he described all 3 of those patches in 1952. He only showed the Explorer version in the picture. Same for Lodge 43. He described, and Lodge 43 seems to have copied Lodge 33. And they issued Explorer and for Scouts, but instead of having a surge patch for Scouters, they went in a different direction. They came out with a blue one for Air Scouts, which is extremely rare, They came out with a white one for Sea Scouts for the white uniform, and they even had a silver background one, which the purpose of that one is still being debated today. Lodge 120 from Illinois, they're nowhere close to Pennsylvania, but they made a flap. Bishop pictured it, and they put in a buttonhole. They dealt with the buttonhole problem by sewing it right into the flap. And so some people collect buttonhole flaps. That's an interesting group. Lodge 168 went in a different direction. Of all of the original flaps, they were the ones that went slightly away from the totem idea and put their lodge name, their lodge number, their council name. They had the whole thing going on their flap. Their version of what to do with a flap ended up becoming much more popular than just the totems. This one with the Indian chief is Lodge 176 in North Dakota. How they ever figured out to have a flap, I don't know. And, and then this one, of course, from Lodge 272 down in the tip of Texas, Brownsville, Texas, is like the premier first flap to get, one of the best. This one next to it, the White Panther, the original White Panther from Mississippi, is another premium patch. I think Larry keeps that as his background on his Zoom meeting, if I'm not mistaken. This one is included, the Chappaget, because Dwight included it. If you look over to the back of the book, he lists all the flaps that he was aware of, whether he pictured them or not, and then he described them. And number 2 over here, black background, inverted pocket flap, yellow beaver, Chappaget 15. Now, as far as I know, this patch was never worn on a flap. It might have been, maybe Michael knows something about that, or Alan or Kirk or any of the guys, but from my research with it, it was worn above the pocket flap. And for whatever reason, Dwight decided, well, this is flap shaped, it's just upside down. Okay. These are a grouping of other flaps that are known to have been issued at the time that Dwight published his book. He just didn't have them. He hadn't seen them. And they're not in the book, but they have pretty good documentation that they were around and available at that time in 1952. There are some interesting ones here. For example, we have a couple of chapter flaps, Uniloctigo from 11 and Petapan from Lodge 24. We talked about the Petapan flap on the digital Crackle Barrel a couple months ago. This one is also a buttonhole flap right through the middle of the blue heron. I think the button's a little bit high on that. I'm not exactly sure how they made that work. And then we have another buttonhole flap from Lodge 136 from Illinois. These are all pretty good flaps across the board, and some of them are spectacular. One of the ones that I find interesting is the original Lodge 337, which through my research, that's the only other lodge besides Lodge 33 that ever had a flap that you had to crimp to the shape of the pocket flap. And I thought that was pretty interesting. This one, but most of the time you see these Lodge 337 flaps from Eau Claire, Wisconsin, and you see them cut out around the eagle. So the way that they mostly wore these was they just cut them out of the twill and then sewed them onto the pocket flap. So it's kind of a rare thing to find one that has all of its cloth still on it and actually evidence that it had been crimped and sewn. Lodge 430 from California had a chenille flap right at the beginning. That's probably the first chenille flap there ever was. And that, where they come up with that idea, who knows? That's from Anaheim, California, where Disneyland, the original Disneyland is. Lodge 207 from Palo Alto went with the large size of flap. that the 33 was, and they had a border on it. And apparently with Lodge 207, they made the patch, but they didn't wear it on the pocket flap. They wore it on a neckerchief, a red and white neckerchief. I've always wondered about that. Again, Alan may have some information on that, but I thought that they made it up and they couldn't get approval to wear it on the uniform. So instead of throwing it away, they put it on a neckerchief and used it as a neckerchief patch. And then over here on the left, for our New England friends, this is the monster bad boy 297 F1 with a cut edge. One of the best flaps going, came out around 1950, has its own story that's pretty interesting as to why it's so tough. This is another set to collect. If you want a small collection of things and drive yourself crazy and spend all your money, then this would be one of the little sets that you would want to collect and probably keep you busy for the rest of your scouting career. And then in 1954, the National Committee on Badges and Insignia realized that they couldn't control flap patches. There were lots and lots of them on uniforms at the 53 Jamboree, and they, I don't know, I wasn't there, I wasn't part of their discussions, but they decided, well, you know, if you can't beat them, join them. And so they decided to make the right pocket the official location for Order of the Arrow insignia, and the National Committee of the OA strongly suggested that all lodges make their patch to fit in that location. Now, again, in the early days, and this is out of the book of the 1954 printing that was introduced at the 54 NOAC, and you see area conference flaps, you see a couple of chapter flaps, you see activity flaps and stuff. The only thing that ever got listed until just 20 years ago or less, the only thing that ever got listed were regular lodge issues that weren't dated, they weren't NOACs, they weren't area conferences, they weren't activities or events. That was a kind of a unique thing about how OA cataloging evolved along the way. But some of these that were issued for other things are good patches and are regionally coveted by the collectors, like this one, the Area 6A in the South. And pretty much that's how we got to where we got. And from those very humble beginnings and the whole thing getting out of hand and out of control, kind of in a rogue way, here we are 100,000 flaps later, coming out in multicolored borders, and who knows, 10 a week, as fast as they can get them out for every lodge you can think of. And this is a story of how it all started. In my somewhat arbitrary way of thinking, so the golden age of flaps ends in 54, okay? And then 1955 starts the silver age of flaps. And again, this is arbitrary. It's just how I sort of see the world of flaps, that the silver age of flaps lasted through 1979. So another 25 years. And you know, I'm hoping as time goes by that I can prepare some presentations for the Cracker Barrel on different aspects of the silver age of flaps. Because
right.
it's during the silver age of flaps that you get into some really crazy stuff, design stuff, which I know you're into. But patches with 16 colors in them, patches that are restricted, one per lifetime, the whole thing with restrictions and all that stuff is pretty interesting, and most of it all developed in the silver age.
You mentioned about Lodge 33 is now Lodge 2. Tell us about
it. Yeah. So I can't remember what year. I want to say it was 2014 or 15, maybe right before the 100th or after the 100th for the OA. But Ojapoo 33, which is on the opposite side of the state where I'm from, they went through Central New Jersey Council, split up, and it was Sockowit Lodge 2. And what happened was Bucks County Council absorbed part of that council. So they retained the Ojapoo Lodge name, but took the number from Sockowit Lodge 2. They kept the deer totem and all that. So they're still a lodge, just a little bit bigger than they were originally.
When it comes to the 272 Sateen from Brownsville, Texas, McAllen, Texas, here's one of the things that we know. We know that the 272 Sateen that's pictured in the WA book was a prototype. It came without a number on it and a different colored dove, a brown dove instead of a gray dove. And it was Dwight Bishop himself who put the number onto the flap. And he got that flap by writing the council office. And he was doing most of his work writing council offices. Probably most of it was done in 1950 and 51. And so he got that from the council office with a note that said, our flap, when it comes out, will be just like this, but it'll have a gray dove instead of a brown dove, and it'll have a red number on it. So that gives us a pretty good idea on that one, Dave, that the 272 Sateen probably came out in around 1951.